Once upon a time, a young company by the name of Square-chan was running to school, Toast clenched firmly in her mouth, when she happened to turn a corner and run flat into Nintendo Senpai. At the time, it was the most embarrassing moment of her life, but little did she know that this chance meeting would soon blossom into a wonderful video game. "You bad!" Square-chan yelped as she bounced off Nintendo Senpai's muscular chest, feeling her face go beet red as she fell towards the pavement. She braced for the impact and shut her eyes, but to her surprise, it never came. Nintendo Senpai had gripped her arm with his rugged hands, which were scarred from handling Nintendium at his Oyaji's local metalsmith. Arigato, Nintendo Senpai," she stuttered quietly. She was unsure whether or not he had heard it, but she didn't mind either way, wanting nothing more than to get out of the situation at hand. Realizing she was still staring at her feet, Square-chan slowly brought her gaze up to meet his and noticed that Nintendo Senpai, in an incredible show of dexterity, had managed to catch Square-chan's wayward toast in his mouth. She watched as he took a bite of it, then handed it back to her, with a curt, "Thanks for the grub." He flipped on his signature aviator glasses as he spun around, casually holding his school bag over his shoulder with one hand, and continued his walk towards school without even missing a beat. Square-chan would have been extremely impressed with how mad cool he was, but she was caught in a new predicament. The only way to eat her toast involved an indirect kiss with Nintendo Senpai, a kiss with the OG of North Nippon High. As Square-chan approached the school gates, she held in her hand the very corner of her toast. All that was left was a tiny chunk that she had carefully nibbled around in order to avoid an uncouth interactions with the area Nintendo Senpai had bitten. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she muttered to herself, considering the insanity of hanging on to a piece of bread. Before she could fully parse the thought, her best Tamagotchi, Treasure-san, had appeared alongside her. "Ohio, Square-chan!" she yelled, hoping to get a rise out of the young Kabushiki geisha. "What's that you got there?" Treasure-san inquired. Nothing at all," Square-chan cried out as she quickly hid the toast in her lucky thigh highs. "It wouldn't happen to be a gift from Nintendo Senpai, would it?" Treasure-san asked, with an impish grin forming on her face. "I saw the whole thing back there. He's pretty slick, huh? So, what are you gonna do with that?" "Oh, Air, you saw that?" Square-chan whispered to Treasure-san, blushing furiously. "Yep, from beginning to end. Now, I don't know what kind of girl would shove used toast down her leggings, but you must like him something fierce if you're doing that, huh?" Square-chan sighed and looked up towards her friend. "I like how much of a hard worker he is, managing to keep up a handheld and a console going at the same time. Even after he messed up with that virtual thing, he jumped right back into the race. There just aren't really many guys like that around, you know? And his aviator classes give me the vapors." She trailed off towards the end, but Treasure-san had heard all she needed to know. "You need to make a game with him," she explained. "A game? No, I barely know him. I can't just go making games with people like that. I need to start small." Treasure-san sighed. "Look, I'll talk to Sega Dono. I'm sure I can get him to make Nintendo Senpai notice you. He and I just made some games after all. It'll be cake," Treasure-san affirmed, pumping her arms with a grin. Square-chan yelped and blushed even furiouser and furiouser. "Treasure-san! You can't just tell me about you and Sega Dono making She couldn't even bring herself to say it, her mind cluttered with images of no longer being able to marry. "He loves it when I do the 7-Force," Treasure-san whispered slyly before running off towards the school. As Square-chan trailed behind, chest tightened as the thought of Treasure-san helping her out with Nintendo Senpai. It felt like a milestone was being reached. She recited some beautiful haiku or something. Treasure-san jostled her way through the busy halls of North Nippon High, moving confidently to the student council room where she was sure she'd find Sega Senpai. But when she flung open the door with a Genki smile, she was greeted with not a welcome, but a yell of "Freeze!" Treasure-san yelped and flung her hands above her head. When she saw him, Sega Senpai was crouched behind an overturned desk, pointing a gun her way with a serious look on his face. "What the hell's going on here? I need to get out of this mess." She quickly glanced around, surveying the room, then acted instinctively. She kicked her shoe off straight at Sega Senpai with impeccable aim, knocking his weapon out of position, then flipping over the nearest desk and leapt behind it. She hollered her mightiest "Tora!" and kicked off toward Sega Senpai with the desk acting as a makeshift shield. Treasure-san couldn't see through it, obviously, but she could feel the moment when she had pinned Sega Senpai against the wall. "What's the big idea, man? Put that thing down," she cried at him.
"Wait, hang on. I think there's been a misunderstanding. It's just a toy,"
Sega Senpai yelled at her.
"A toy?"
Treasure-san was incredulous. Sega Senpai was most well known for two things. The first was that he was a perfect student, A+ and 100% across the board. He was head of student council, and under his hand, class attendance had risen to an all-time high, and running unsigned code at school had been driven out completely. The second thing he was known for was an unquenchable thirst for accessories and silly toys that he claimed would be the new face of the game industry. His uncle, Sanshiro, had always been a bad influence on him that way, but from the Activator to the 32X, Sega Senpai was always blind to the fact that everybody thought they were a little silly.
"This Treasure-san is the Justifier,"
he exclaimed, yelling out its name and thrusting it skyward.
"With this, no criminals will ever escape my reach."
He spun around a few times and waggled his arms around like an unimpressive bargain bin tokusatsu hero.
"Konami-sama and I made it over the weekend. With this, I finally have the edge over Nintendo Senpai."
Treasure-san briefly thought about mentioning the zapper, but felt like that might be a bit too much to handle for Sega Senpai, who was always straddling the edge of confidence. He continued pointing it around the room in a way that he must have thought looked cool, but was just incredibly awkward to watch. "So, would I be able to ask you a favor, Sega Senpai?" Treasure-san said.
"Sure, what do you need?"
he replied without ever stopping his wild gesticulations, and slowly faced Treasure-san, an air of seriousness coming over the room. "Do you think you could get Nintendo Senpai to talk to someone?" Sega Senpai dropped the Justifier and slowly faced Treasure-san, an air of seriousness coming over the room.
"I don't ever want to talk to him again, and I doubt you can convince me that there's any reason good enough to."
Treasure-san swallowed nervously before it came to her. "Hey, you know the game we're working on, Alien Soldier?" Treasure inquired.
"Yes, what of it?"
Sega Senpai was clearly trying to dodge the issue. "Well, what if the next time we got together to work on it, I brought out the 7 Force again? Would that change your mind?" Treasure-san asked, raising an eyebrow. Sega Senpai's face went red. She knew how amazing the 7 Force had been last time they had made a game. There was no way he turned this down without giving him a chance to breathe. She grabbed at his tie and pulled his face forward, whispering into his ear. "For Mega Driver's custom, Visual Shock, Speed Shock, Sound Shock. Now it's time to the 68,000 Hold on Fire." As Sega Senpai walked down the halls after school, he was struggling internally with how he was going to convince Nintendo Senpai to talk to this Square-chan girl he'd been told about. For starters, there was the issue of Nintendo Senpai almost always managing to one-up him in all of their marketplace endeavors. Sega Senpai was still successful, no doubt, but when you get second place that many times in a row, it starts to wear on you. He had considered simply dropping the matter, but thoughts of Treasure-san and her amazing 7 Force always trickled to the forefront of his thoughts. He blushed, thinking about how amazing 7 Force was. I mean, damn, 7 Force was hot shit. He pulled himself away from lewd thoughts and forced himself to rethink the situation. But as he turned the corner, he ran straight into Nintendo Senpai. The two bounced off each other's muscular chests like giant ripped bumper cars, and as both of them fell over, they grabbed each other's arms and pulled each other back up. If one of them had been a girl, it would have been Splash Mountain in here, for real. They both stared each other down before Sega Senpai broke the silence.
"Nintendo Senpai, I need to ask a favor of you. I don't know what it'll take from me, but I need you to meet up with a girl, even if it's only for a few minutes. I absolutely need to make this meeting happen."
Sega Senpai spoke loudly and purposefully.
"Please, there's a lot at stake here for me. I need you to help me out."
Nintendo Senpai locked eyes with his rival, unsure what to make of the situation.
"The way you speak really makes it sound like you're desperate. Explain yourself."
Sega Senpai's eyes dove aside as he scratched the back of his head.
I really can't say it out loud."
He began to blush.
Then you'll get nothing from me today, Sega-senpai. Good day.
Nintendo Senpai turned to leave, and Sega Senpai became desperate. He grabbed for Nintendo Senpai's arm, yelling out,
Wait! I'll tell you.
He looked both ways down the hallway, then started to whisper into Nintendo Senpai's ear. Nintendo Senpai went through a variety of facial expressions. His neutral, almost mean face gave way to an expression of cynicism. Then a blush slowly faded in. As Nintendo Senpai became aware of the stakes, his face grew redder and redder until he too was furiously red. Sega Senpai eventually stepped away. Both of them were facing the ground, thoughts fixated on Treasure-san's 7 Force.
Okay, I'll help you,
shouted Nintendo Senpai, trying to keep his cool.
Who's the girl?
Her name's Square-chan. Apparently you two met this morning. If you could just speak with her for a bit, I'd be able to... you know.
Sega Senpai had never been more embarrassed.
You've got yourself a deal, Sega-senpai. A real man knows when his brothers need assistance, and it's clear that this is one of your greatest moments of peril. I'll help.
Nintendo Senpai turned to leave as he usually would, but was clearly putting in extra effort to get away from the situation that had been brought up. He didn't like people seeing him this way. Sega Senpai looked up at Nintendo Senpai's back, chiseled traps visible even through his Nipponese Gakuren. A single tear slid down both of their faces. Truly, they were the best of rivals. Truly, they were the best of friends. Nintendo Senpai decided to wait by the school gates for her. He felt a little nervous, and frankly, he wasn't sure why. He'd made many games with tons of companies before, let alone just talking to one. She wasn't special, as far as he knew. So, why did he feel like this? Before he could properly think it through, he saw her walking out of the main entrance. Square-chan. He closed his eyes.
You're doing this for Sega-senpai, for your true Tamagotchi.
His heart beat faster. He opened his eyes and found that she was halfway to him. He gulped and pulled off his aviators, hanging them at the bottom of his collar.
Square-chan?
He called out in his deep, muscular voice. She looked up at him, and realizing who it was, she began to blush, which in turn made Nintendo Senpai begin to blush as well. He was confused. He never felt this way before. No other company gave him the flutters like this. Maybe she was something special.
Can I walk home with you tonight?
He asked, glancing skyward.
Me?
She stammered, pointing at her face.
Yeah, you. Come on, let's hit the road.
He turned to go, knowing she'd follow along. He knew it would look cool, but he was actually trying to avoid facing her, for fear she would notice his blush, if she could even muster the courage to look at his face. They walked home together in silence, both trying to just hold it together, until they reached her front door.
This is me, I guess,
she said, barely audible.
Okay, good night then,
said Nintendo Senpai, turning to go. She breathed deeply before speaking up barely louder than before.
What?
She whispered. He didn't hear. Glancing around, she began to panic. Would she lose her chance over her inability to talk to ridiculously built high school boys?
Wait!
In actuality, it had only felt like a yell, being that it was so much louder than she had meant to say it. Nonetheless, Nintendo Senpai heard her cry. He turned around.
Would you maybe just, if you have the time, maybe think about doing this again? Maybe tomorrow? Please, Nintendo Senpai?
She bowed her head.
Sure, no problem,
he said, starting to walk away.
What? It was that easy?
She thought to herself. As he walked away, she spoke out a curt,
Thanks,
hoping he had heard. Then she finished her toast. The months following their walk home were possibly the happiest months in Square-chan's life. She and Nintendo Senpai had started dating, and the romantic escapades quickly became highlights of her high school career. Nintendo Senpai was surprised at how things went as well. It wasn't his first time dating, but the way he felt towards Square-chan made it feel like it was. One day, after a prolonged visit to Legoland Nippon, Nintendo Senpai finally built up the nerve to ask the question.
Square-chan, would you want to make a game with me?
His face went red as he asked her.
Eh? A game? I've never done that with anyone else before.
She also blushed.
If you're okay with me, I'd love to try making a game with you, Nintendo-senpai.
Nintendo-senpai approached her and pulled her into a loving hand-holding session, as all intimate Japanese couples are known for. Even though he had gotten the best possible answer, he was still as nervous as could be. What if his hardware wasn't blast enough? Was his sound card okay? There were questions he would force himself to forget in order to make Square-chan's first game-making session a memorable one. They walked off together into the Legoland Nippon sunset. It was time to get to work.
It really means a lot that you would come and do this with me,
Nintendo-senpai said quietly as they sat down on the edge of his bed, trying to break the ice that had been reformed by their mutual shyness of the events about to transpire.
I really want to make an RPG with you, Square-chan.
She looked up at him shyly.
Why do you want an RPG, Nintendo-senpai? This is a special moment. I can make you something more unique. Something like Uniracers or...
Square-chan was unsure of herself. RPGs were her calling, but she really wanted to do something special today.
Square-chan, it's just, your RPGs are amazing. They sparkle and glimmer like no other. They have no equal. I guess I just want a chance to be a part of that.
Square-chan blushed furiously.
He likes my RPGs? He really likes them?
She thought to herself, smothering her face in her hands to hide her embarrassment.
You can use Mario if you want,
muttered Nintendo-senpai. Suddenly, Square-chan split her fingers apart, revealing her eyes. They had a manic sparkle that he'd never seen in her before.
Mario, huh? Then what are we waiting for?
She shoved him down onto the bed.
Let's do this, Nintendo-senpai. Let's make the Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars.
They laid there, panting, trying to catch their breath. A small Super Famicom cartridge nestled between them. Square-chan had made games before, sure. She'd even made games for the Super Famicom, like this one. But it'd always been just her, alone. Actually, doing it with someone else, and a first party no less, was incredible. Nintendo-senpai knew all the tricks to the machine, and boy did they go deep. Nintendo-senpai's legendary Miyamoto was just as huge as expected, to the point where her Sakaguchi could barely take it. But they made it work, and it was amazing. Truly, this was a game that would go down as one of the most impressive on the console.
That was amazing, Square-chan,
said Nintendo-senpai, rolling his head over to face her. He was slightly taken aback because at some point Square-chan must have put on his aviators because she was still wearing them. Well, whatever, it was a crazy night.
We should, do this again someday, don't you think?
He inquired lovingly.
Yeah, definitely.
Square-chan was having difficulty speaking between breaths.
Next time, I want to see your new stuff. You know, the stuff everyone's talking about.
Nintendo-senpai froze up. Did she mean Project Reality? How could she possibly know about that? Were the Gaijins leaking information? Still, it had been amazing. Maybe it would be worth giving her an early look. Having her on board would really show Sega-senpai he meant business for next gen.
I'll see if I can get you some, early access maybe.
He tapered off towards the end, but it didn't matter. He had gotten the message across loud and clear. She flipped the glasses up with a smile and reached over, kissing him on the cheek.
You know, Nintendo-senpai, I think I'm in love with you.
Nintendo-senpai's heart skipped a beat. He'd never been so close with someone before. Was that what this feeling was? Love? He tried to gather his thoughts, but before everything was nicely arranged, he stammered out,
Me too.
Tadaima!
Square-chan called out as she flipped off her shoes. Okaeri! Hollered Papa Square, welcoming his daughter home.
Have a good day with your friend?
Square-chan blushed.
Yeah, it was pretty fun. We went to Legoland Nippon.
She forced herself not to think of lewd, game-making activities in front of her parents. Her mom walked into the room, having just changed into PJs.
Dear, we have something we need to discuss with you tonight,
said Mama Square. Papa Square's smile dropped. He was always the more friendly parent. Mama Square was direct and serious, wanting nothing less than success for her family.
The other day, to turn 19 this month, we need to begin speaking about your future as a game company.
Gulp.
This is not what Square-chan wanted to hear after her amazing relations with Nintendo Senpai had just begun.
We've had an up-and-comer we want you to meet with. He's a great grasp on his idea for next gen, and we really think he could help you become successful.
Just then, a slender boy walked into the room, about her age. He had short silver hair and a face metaphorically carved by angels.
Honey, this is Sony Senpai.
Hey there, nice to meet you,
said Sony Senpai, extending his arms towards her for a sick fist bump. Square-chan didn't follow through on the fist bump. She didn't move a muscle. They couldn't see it yet, but she was furious.
You think you could just force a guy on me? This is garbage. I won't accept this,
she shouted. Sony Senpai withdrew his arm, a faint look of surprise on his face. The flower he'd been promised was more thorny than expected.
Now, honey,
began Mama Square.
I know it's a bit of a surprise. I know you had other plans, but we were approached by the Honorable Sony family concerning Next Gen. They really know what they're doing.
She smiled at her daughter.
Play your cards right with this and you'll be set for life.
Square-chan felt nothing but contempt for Mama Square. And this Sony Senpai guy? Jeez, what kind of an asshole would accept a family offering their daughter up without her direct consent? She knew his type, and she wanted none of it. Blowing out her cheeks, she turned and stomped up the stairs to her room.
Next gen, huh?
She flattened a handful of papers onto her desk and grabbed a pen.
If next gen's what they want, then that's what I'll give them.
Square-chan wasn't in a particularly creative mood, despite her hopes. That said, she had the drive. She penned out what would soon become a Final Fantasy tech demo for a next-gen machine. She didn't know what Nintendo Senpai's plans were, but she just knew she'd blow the doors out with what she was making. Late last night, Nintendo Senpai had received a most peculiar phone call. Square-chan sounded off. Being that he never heard her when she was angry, he couldn't properly identify what exactly it was. He just knew that she was clearly on edge.
Nintendo Senpai, I need you to bring your new hardware tomorrow. I've been working on a new thing I think you'll like, and...
She took a big breath and slowed her speech down. Unbeknown to Nintendo Senpai, tears were flowing freely down her cheeks. Her stern voice covered up her confused emotions.
I know it's a lot to ask, and I know we've only been with each other for a little while, but I really need this right now.
Nintendo Senpai was already on board.
No, it's no problem. I'll hurry it along a bit and I'll bring it with me tomorrow. It's not quite where I want it to be right now, but I'm sure you can work with early hardware, right?
Square-chan was unsure. She's never done such a large 3D undertaking before, but she had no choice. She had to prove to her parents that she knew where she was going. She had to show them they were wrong about next gen. Nintendo Senpai was hers now, and there was no way she was going to let him go for some slimy guy like Sony Senpai. She nodded silently.
I'll make it work. Early hardware or not, the fact that it's yours is what counts. I'll do anything so that you and I can have an amazing next-gen together. It's a promise.
She hung up the phone suddenly as she started to blush at the words she had been saying, tears still slipping down her face. Nintendo Senpai moved over to his Oyaji's workbench and started thinking to himself. He had a lot of work ahead of himself if he was going to bring this out for her tomorrow. It was going to be a long night. Square-chan was impatiently tapping her foot. She'd been leaning against the outer wall of the hotel where she was supposed to meet with Nintendo Senpai for around 20 minutes, out of which he had been late by 10. She was perhaps a little overdressed for the occasion, wearing swirly glasses and a red headband that she swore would improve her game-making abilities. Square-chan was intent on doing everything she possibly could to ensure her next-gen test game would properly operate. There were concerns, naturally, but she felt pretty confident in her array of backup plans that she'd been able to make something work, regardless of the hurdles involved. Mama Square would eat her words when she saw this amazing Final Fantasy VI remake, no doubt. Suddenly, Nintendo Senpai rounded the corner at a jog. He was running in perfect form, as you'd expect from a hunkalicious guy like him, but as he approached, it was very clear that he was pushing himself to the limit. Even with his aviator glasses on, the bags under his eyes were clearly visible. Such was the face of a man who had not slept.
Omatase shimashite.
He spoke slowly, trying to not sound as dead as he felt.
I was putting the finishing touches on the new stuff. It took a bit more out of me than expected.
He cracked a smile. Square-chan did not. Not out of dislike for Nintendo Senpai, but under the absurd stress that was imposed on her. She simply couldn't accept such a pleasure.
Well, now that we're both here, do you want to head straight in?
Nintendo Senpai was surprised by how forward she was. She was the meekest girl he'd ever seen last time they made a game together, but now she was practically dragging him into the next project. It wasn't a bad change, he supposed. They went inside, got a room, and headed up. After some more small talk, Square-chan asked to begin. Nintendo Senpai undid his belt buckle and pulled down his pants. Square-chan licked her lips and blushed as she bore witness to the biggest, blackest thing she'd ever seen. Nintendo Senpai gulped.
I call it the Ultra 64.
As they got into it, Square-chan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hardware was way stronger than anything she'd worked with before, and it felt amazing when something would click, but for every plus, there was at least one negative waiting for her. The storage was too limited, for example. She had really wanted amazing 3D movies punctuating every story beat, but when Nintendo Senpai explained that they were still using cartridges, she realized she couldn't do that. And the controller. Damn, this awkward, three-pronged thing was the controller? It felt comfy, but unwieldy all at the same time.
Is this made for octopuses?
She thought to herself as she fondled the Z button. Making games was supposed to feel amazing and fulfilling, but why did she constantly feel as though she was second-guessing herself? Nintendo Senpai was clearly having an amazing time, but for Square-chan it just felt unsatisfying. Had she planned for specs that were impossibly high and set her expectations higher than could be possible? She looked over her papers, making sure that she wasn't crazy, and lo, she wasn't. Nintendo Senpai's hardware was just weaker than expected, and it certainly felt that way. Growing nervous, she felt like there was only one way out of this situation. One terrible way. And that would surely hurt Nintendo Senpai's feelings, but she needed out. She needed to rethink this whole game. If this was the future for Nintendo Senpai, she needed to make sure this was a future she could be happy with. One where she wasn't restricted and could accomplish her dreams.
Nintendo Senpai?
She spoke softly.
What's up, Square-chan?
It had started to rain. Square-chan walked alongside Nintendo Senpai in complete silence, her eyes firmly fixed on the floor, guilt welling up in her stomach. She felt like something was wrong with her. Design's more important than specs, anyways. So why did she have such a problem with the specs the way they were? She shook her head, pushing the thoughts as far back as they could go. She just needed some rest. Yeah. Tomorrow morning she'd snap to it and realize that she was happy with the way things were. Nintendo Senpai broke the silence.
Was it really that bad?
He barely muttered the words, head hung as though walking to the gallows. He had been worried about showing it off too early, and he felt like Square-chan's actions spoke volumes about it.
No, it wasn't bad at all. I just got in a little spat with my parents, and I can't really get it off my mind. It's not your fault. It's totally me.
She feigned a smile.
Your Ultra 64 is pretty awesome.
She lied outright. He breathed deeply and sighed.
It's a relief to hear that. I was worried you hated it. I was worried you'd stop developing with me.
Square-chan grabbed his hand as they continued walking.
Come on, silly. We'll always be together. I'm just having an off day.
Nintendo Senpai squeezed her hand.
You think so?
He wondered out loud.
Definitely. Forever.
Square-chan closed the door slowly and quietly as possible as she tiptoed into her house. It was later than anticipated, and the last thing she wanted to do was wake up her parents. She slowly moved into her room, and once she had crossed that threshold, she exhaled for the first time since entering the house. Safe. Turning on her lamp, she began to remove her hair clips, but she noticed a letter on her desk with the words, Square-chan, written across the front. She recognized that handwriting. It was Mama Square's. She sighed and tore open the letter.
To my beloved daughter, I know we don't always see eye to eye, and I know that I've been pretty harsh with you lately, but I want you to know that it's only because I care for you. I want you to enjoy a happy life and a lucrative future. But with the way you're headed right now, I just don't think that's gonna happen for you. Please do me a favor as your parent and someone who loves you more than life itself. Please make a game with Sony Senpai. It doesn't have to be anything romantic, just a plain platonic game, made out of the desire for individual success. Papa Square and I believe Sony Senpai knows what he's doing for the future, and we'd be crushed if you missed the opportunity. Please just make one game with Sony Senpai. If it goes poorly, I can promise you that I'll never bother you about this again. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Mama Square, XOXO.
Square Chan crumpled the letter and tossed it vaguely towards the garbage bin.
You'll never bug me again, huh?
She sighed. Well, whatever. Nothing to lose, she figured.
One game with this Sony senpai loser, nothing romantic. What could possibly go wrong?
As he opened the door to let her in, his mouth fell slightly agape. Sony Senpai had somewhat lost hope of ever seeing Square Chan again after her recent outburst, but lo and behold, there she was, on his front doorstep. He had a bit of a crush on her ever since his earlier work on the SNES CD, and it had hurt him to see her hanging around Nintendo Senpai after the way Nintendo Senpai had treated him in the past.
Are you busy right now?
She asked plainly. He couldn't detect a hint of emotion in her voice.
No, come on in.
He stepped aside and swept his arm inwards, inviting her to come in.
I was just making some tea. Would you like some?
Square Chan was completely silent. The seconds grew long and the pause became awkward, but it was broken by the whistling of Sony Senpai's heated kettle.
Whoops, let me just get that. You can head on in if you want.
He pointed to the living room as he hurried over to the kitchen, trying not to sound too happy that he could break the silence. Square Chan meandered over to the single-seated sofa, choosing a seat that Sony Senpai wouldn't be able to sit next to her in. Her hands were wrung tightly around each other, her mind racing about the events yet to unfold. Meanwhile, Sony Senpai's thoughts were firing around at the same pace.
Why is she here? I thought she hated me.
He couldn't deny that he was happy to have her show up like this, but he wished that it was under less stressful circumstances. He shook his head.
Come on, man. Just focus on being nice. Don't do anything weird. You can do this.
He slapped his cheeks gently, forcing his mental state to calm a little. Grabbing the loaded tea kettle, he walked confidently into the living room and placed it on a small coffee table. Square Chan forced herself to grab the tea, if only to try to calm herself down.
Whoa, be careful, it's hot,
Sony Senpai warned. She ignored him, mostly out of indignation. The tea was incredibly hot, scalding even, but she forced the sip down. Square Chan didn't want Sony Senpai to get the impression she'd listened to a single thing he said. She was here with a goal in mind, and that razor focus was all she had right now.
So, what brings you here today?
Square Chan didn't let him finish.
Okay, look, I'm here to make a game with you, like you wanted. We're gonna do this here and now and get this garbage over with.
Sony Senpai's jaw dropped.
Well, a game? Shouldn't we, get to know each other first or something, right?
She didn't give him a chance. She had knocked him backwards onto the ground and was already pulling off his pants, out from which slid a big, smooth PlayStation. Square Chan giggled to herself.
Heh, figures. It's smaller than Nintendo Senpai's. You're all talk, huh?
She had to admit that the controllers dangling from it were really nice. Simple, traditional designs, nothing weird. Good stuff, but that was it. There was no way some newcomer could possibly make something decent on his first go. Sony Senpai felt moderately hurt after what she'd just said, so he immediately pulled out the big guns. Hitting the eject button, he pulled out a CD and held it up in front of her.
Ridge Racer.
Square Chan was unimpressed.
Ridge Racer?
Ridge Racer!
Square Chan was impressed enough to really start getting down to business. And boy, did she. Her apprehension slid away as she fell into the regular pace of making a game, trying to create something she could be proud of without getting too attached to the undesirable she had to do with. But there was something different this time. She could feel it at every turn. The machine was well oiled, and working with it was deeply satisfying. She felt ecstatic and she peppered FMVs into the game, feeling freed from the restrictions of cartridges. Everything was clicking. Everything felt amazing, and her inhibitions were rapidly slipping away. And as climax came closer and closer, the game steadily became one of the greats, a game to surpass all that had come before. Final Fantasy VII. They hit climax. Everything was good in the world, if only for a moment. Sony Senpai broke the silence of their passionate embrace.
Thanks so much for this opportunity. I've always wanted to make a game with an amazing company like you. Did you think the PlayStation was okay?
He spoke in a sheepish manner.
Okay, it's the best. I didn't even see how anyone could compete with something like this.
Square Chan exclaimed, all thoughts of Nintendo Senpai gone from her mind. She had a new love.
I think I'm done with Nintendo Senpai. He had a tiny dick anyways.
She grinned from ear to ear as she said it, happier, than she'd ever been. End of Smoking, Destroy of Heart arc.
Ridge Racer!
Square Chan was impressed.